My name's Kip Collins, and I am an alcoholic. And thank you all for inviting me out here tonight. Too hot for me. I live on the beach. I'd like to ask this question at all meetings. This morning in your prayers and meditation, how many of you asked God what you could do for me today? One. It's because you're all selfish and self-centered and self-seeking. Now tomorrow I want you to get up and say, what can I do to make Kip's life a little bit easier? I say this because I love you and I want you to get out of yourself right away. You know? And I need all the help I can get. My sobriety date's May 12th, 1984, and my home group is Robbers Roost. Men's meeting, closed meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, meets at 6:30 on Thursday nights. You know, I want to mention this before I get started. I had a funny thing happened on the way to the airport. I'm waiting for a shuttle, and the guy was late. And the guy pulled into my driveway, and he's running around kind of frantic, and I recognized him. He was one of us. You know, he was sweating profusely, and it wasn't warm. And I got in the thing, and I started talking, and he's rambling on, and we started talking. He says, well, where do you work? And I said, well, I'm the manager for Casa Rafael. Casa Rafael is a very, very large recovery home. We have 135 homeless men that live there. And right away, he got real quiet, you know. And pretty soon he started talking, and his wife had left him. Can you imagine that? You know. And he started telling me, he says, you know, God, and she's bugging me. God, I'm about a year behind on my child support. And I said, so tell me, Tom, that means you don't have a driver's license, right? And he got real nervous, and he looked in the mirror, and he says, yeah, but I drive real good. I said, that's all right, you know. But we started talking, you know. By the time we got to the airport, it's a 45-minute ride. He was crying his eyes out, you know, and hi. He was crying his eyes out, you know, and I gave him my card, and I said, call me, and he said, oh, I will. I said, on better chance, give me your phone number. I'll call you when I get home. You know, and I told him that I was going to pray for him, so I'd like all of us to keep Tom in our prayers. He's one of us, and he isn't here yet, and he's on his way, so God bless you, Tom. Anyway, here we go. My father is Irish and Sioux. And my mother's Irish and Cherokee. And when my father drank, my mama liked to fight. You know, it was like this, just a general way. Be laying in bed with my brother. We were only 11 months apart, me and Bill, and the later it got, the scarier we were. For a while, you'd hear that old pickup coming up that dirt road. And if you looked out the windows, you see all the neighbors turning off their lights and getting their lawn chairs and coming outside. And that's what it was like. And I was never, ever, ever going to be like my father. And I can think of many times me and my brother laying there scared. We'd talk about what kind of men we wanted to be, what kind of fathers we were going to be, what kind of husbands we were going to be. It wasn't nothing like that, man. You know, I lived in an all Hispanic neighborhood. First generation, Spanish was the language in that neighborhood. I had white hair, blue eyes, and very white skin. All my cousins have very dark hair, brown eyes, dark brown skin. And I didn't fit in that neighborhood, and I didn't fit in that family, and we didn't fit in anywhere we went. You know, but my father was very, very violent. He was a violent drunk. I don't know if he's an alcoholic. That's his decision. But I'll tell you this, I do not blame my alcoholism on my father. If anything in the world, he taught me exactly what alcohol will do to a man, what it'll do to a family. I mean, he was a prime example of what alcohol will do. I can't put it on him. I like to blame it on the San Diego Unified School District. I was about 12 years old, and this was in the early 60s, and they had this great idea that they needed to get all these youngsters in this room and start warning them about the evils of drugs and narcotics. And I want to tell you right now, that I respect the singleness purpose of Alcoholics Anonymous with all of my heart. But there's a little bit of drugs in my story, and if that bothers you, it's be an opportunity for you to grow tonight. See, I was never going to drink, but they showed us this movie, and they had these people come up and talk, and they're talking about all this stuff. And I was drooling before that was over with, man. I went to my friend Balto. I said, Balto, can you get some of that? And he says, oh, yeah, no problem. My dad smokes it. And I said, okay. So the next day I met him. He says, did you get it? He says, yeah. Meet me after school. So we went to after school. I said, so what do we do? He said, well, we got to go to a liquor store. I said, for what? We got to boost a bottle of wine. I said, what for? He says, I don't know. My dad drinks cheap wine with this stuff. And I was willing to go to any lengths, you know. And so we went in and I boosted my very first short dog, a sweet red port. Wasn't my last. That was my first. We went down this little canyon. We smoked this dope and drank this wine. And oh, Lordy. The gates of heaven opened, you know. For the absolute first time in my whole life, it was comfortable inside. The missing ingredient. I found what I'd been missing. I don't know what alcohol does to other people, but when I put alcohol in my body, everything got calm. You know, for the very first time. I'd never known that feeling. But I wasn't going to be an alcoholic. But since you had to drink wine with that stuff, you know, it wasn't quite the same. That might be denial, I don't know. My mom found my dope. She kicked me out of the house when I was 14. I just got kicked out of school for hitting a teacher. And I was talking to this guy, and I said I didn't know where to go. We lived in this little town, Vista. There ain't nothing there but chickens and rabbits and oranges. And we're reading in the paper, and he says, check this out. Everyone's going up to this town in San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, and all they do is get high and listen to music and make love. I like music. I got in the Haight District about 1964, and things were happening. And I remember small parts of it. And I got an education, you know, I got an education. With other young men, we're going to school and learning trades and going to service and doing all that. You see, I found out something, because my father had always told me if I wanted anything in this world, I had to work real hard, I had to go to school. He didn't do any of it, but he's always telling me what I should be doing, you know. And I got to do all this stuff. And I found out when I was a kid that if I had the bag, I could have anybody or anything I wanted. You know, ain't nothing I'm proud of, but that's just the way it was. And I spoke a little Spanish, you know, and I'm a capitalist at heart. I never did make a good hippie, you know. And I started seeing, you know, the supply and demand, you know, and I'm seeing what they're paying for it here. And I'm going to go to Mexico. And so I started going to Mexico, and I started doing this thing, and very, very profitable. By the time I was 16 years old, I had a lot of money, and I got arrested in Mexico. I got caught with 200 kilos of marijuana. And I was sentenced to 25 years in prison in the Mesa Federal Prison. And I'll tell you right here and right now, nice things don't happen to young, long-haired white boys with long blonde hair and blue eyes. It's not real friendly. And if anything in the world, that should have told me that the way I'm living my life, I had to change. But you see, Mexico is a civilized country. And you can bribe people, you know. My brother called, I got a hold of him, I said, get me out of here, Bill, man, and he started turning things around, because everything I tell you I did, my brother was right with me, man, he was my partner. And he found the right people to buy off, and they got me out of there on $15,000 after about 9 months. And I got out of there, and then I came back up here, and I continued to do what I do, and on my 18th birthday, at 5:30 in the morning, I was arrested at gunpoint for 27 felonies. When I was arrested, I'd been living with this young gal, real nice gal, came from a real nice family, Spanish, and she was pregnant, and we were real excited that we were going to have a baby. And when I went in, I never heard anything from her. She didn't call. I could answer my phone calls. I didn't get any letters. I got no visitors. But after I did that term, I got out of there with a lot of money and a lot of lawyers. I went looking for her, and the family had moved, and I tried to find out what had happened to that baby, because, man, I'd wanted to hold that baby. I'd been dreaming about that baby, and nobody would tell me nothing, and I couldn't find her. And I spent many years looking for her, and always there was this big hole in myself. Something was missing. You know, I ran into this young gal, and she was 15, came from a good family, and her father was a doctor, and I ran into a little bit of bad luck, and she bailed me out of jail 3 times in 1 week. I don't know a hell of a lot about love, but I know a lot about jail. You know, and I figured I ain't never letting this gal out of my sight again. And so I married her, you know, and I took that little girl for a ride. And then one magic day, we went to a hospital, and we went in there. She went in this room, and they came out and they put this little boy in my arms. And that was the most magic moment of my life, other than the alcohol. You know, for the very first time, I held him and I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt head over heels in love with another human being with no conditions. And I'd never known those feelings before with anyone. And I promised this boy what kind of a father I was going to be. And I told him the things we were going to do. And I meant it with all my heart. You know, in a couple of years, we went and the same thing, and they came out and they put this little girl in my arms. And exactly the same thing happened, man. I fell head over heels in love with this little thing. You know, I'm the kind of alcoholic, I don't know if anyone here will relate to this, but I can be sitting at a meeting and a pretty girl can walk in, and before that meeting's over, inside of my head, we've been married, had a couple of kids, she cheated on me, I hate the bitch, you know, and you know, things happen quick up here, you know, and I'm thinking automatically, you know, someday someone's going to come and want to marry her, you know, and she's still wet, you know, they haven't even cut the cord yet, and I'm thinking things like this quickly, and I'm setting conditions, and what kind of a wedding am I going to give her, and all this stuff, you know, and for the next 5 years, I was the best father. I had the money, I had the resources, I didn't have to work. I had a real nice place here. I had a place in Mexico. And I stayed with my kids, and I played with my kids, and I changed their diapers, and I taught them how to talk, and I bathed them, and I cooked for them, and I played with them out in the yard all day long. I loved my children better than life itself. And one day, September 6, 1976, a friend of mine came over, and he brought some real good stuff over, and I got really loaded, and I was outside, and I was playing with my son. And I didn't even think about it. It was real hot. And I just got on my bike and I scooted up to the store to go get a 6-pack of beer. I didn't even think about it, you know. And when I came back down, the police were at my house, and the paramedics and the fire department and all the neighbors, and I waited down there, and I found out my son had chased me out of the driveway and been run over by a truck. And I waded through that crowd of people, and I looked down at him, and his head was split open, and I could see his brains and bones were protruding from his body all over. And a little piece of me died. I sat in that hospital with him in intensive care for 9 months while he was in a coma. We went through brain surgery after brain surgery, and my son survived, but he mentally, emotionally never aged beyond the age of about 4 years old. And he had horrible physical and emotional problems the rest of his life. And I did that to my son. See, he was my responsibility, and I got loaded. And I didn't watch him, and things happened. You know, after my son, we've got him in a special hospital. My brother came down with a disease called schizophrenia. And my family had him committed to a hospital. And it was just like when I was in Mexico, when after they got my brother stabilized, he called me up from this place and he says, "Hey, get me out of here." I said, "Are you okay?" He says, "Yeah, get me out of here." So I went and I got a lawyer. I talked to my mom, and I talked to my dad, talked to everyone, and I talked him into letting me take conservatorship of him. And I got him out of there, and I bought him a mobile home and put it on a piece of property next to mine. And you know, and my brother came back, and we started doing what we do. My brother started getting sick again. He got away from his medication. He started getting loaded with me. And I had to go to Oklahoma on a business deal. And I told my brother, I said, hey man, I gotta go, I'll see you in 3 days. And he grabbed hold of me and he said, don't go nowhere, man. I said, what's up? He says, I don't know, but I'm coming apart, man, don't leave. And I said, I gotta go, Bill, you know how it is, man. I can't hang these people up, I gotta go. And I did what I've always done all my life. I pulled out a handful of money, I put it in his pocket, and I said, here, I'll be back in 3 days and me and you'll fix this. It's always been me and you and it always will. See, money's fixed everything in my life, all my life. And he was crying, and I left. And I came back, the scam I was on went sideways, and I didn't get back for about 2 or 3 weeks. And when I came back, I went looking for my brother, and I couldn't find him. And I went and I opened up that trailer door, and his head rolled out. And 3 days after I left, he had taken a gun, took that money and bought a gun, and he blew his head off. And there was just a pile of maggots laying in that doorway. And another piece of me died that day. You know, the only reason I tell you this, I sure as hell don't need your sympathy. The only point of me telling you is in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it states very clearly, those among us who got here with grave emotional mental disorders, I'm one of those people. You see, something broke completely in half inside of Kip Collins that day. That was never ever to be restored until I completely surrendered to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous with no conditions. And I'll tell you this from my heart to yours, that I thank God that alcohol does for me what alcohol does for me. If alcohol didn't do for me what alcohol does, I would have joined my brother. But you see, alcohol takes away guilt, it takes away pain, it takes away that stuff, it lets me go to sleep. It allows me to walk through this world one day at a time with a little bit of ease and comfort. And they talk a lot about bottoms in AA. I don't know, you know. I'll tell you where I work, I see people die all the time. My ex-mother-in-law, she hit bottom. She spent the last 10 years of her life in a mental institution for indigent women with a wet brain. She didn't know who she was the last 10 years. She hit bottom because she never got no worse after a certain point. I had a man that I had up there where I work, and I just loved this guy. His liver was protruding out to here. We detoxed him, and I worked with him, and he wanted to be sober, worse than anybody you've ever met. He wanted it so bad. And one night I was up there and I saw him, and he was shaking real bad. It had been about 3 weeks. And he had his blanket, and I said, what's up? He says, I gotta go. And I said, hey, you're gonna die. He says, I know. He says, but I gotta have a drink. And he hit bottom because he died the next morning. He ain't never gonna get no worse. It's been my experience as long as I could think, feel, or have anything in this world going on inside my head, that every time I hit a bottom, that I sure as hell find a basement the next day. You know, my wife made a career move about that time. She left with my Coke connection, and she left me with my little girl, Jana Marie, and it was just me and Jana. My son was in a hospital. I couldn't stop drinking. My daughter was terrified. You know, this beautiful life that she had had, it was just like a fairy tale. All of a sudden it exploded, and her uncle, who she loved, you know, he was dead. Her brother, who she was there when he got hit, you know, her mother had left, and her father's a nut, you know, and everything's crazy. And my son was in a special hospital, and this guy came over to my house, and he brought this big bottle of this stuff called Mad Dog 2020. They have that in Arizona? You people look like the kind of folks that just drink that wine that comes with a cork, you know? I'm surprised. Lamar, you lied to me. I drank this stuff, and I'll tell you, this lady tapped me on the shoulder and said, sir, and I woke up and I looked. She said, you have to get off the airplane. I had been sitting in my living room the last I knew, and I looked around. I'm on this jet, you know, and it's completely empty, and my little girl's all cuddled up next to me, and I can't figure out what's going on. And I said, where am I? She said, you're in Fort Lauderdale. I said, I hate Fort Lauderdale. She goes, I don't know anything about it, but you got to get off the plane, you know. So I'm waking my daughter up and saying, well, we got to get off the plane, and I'm hoping she's going to tell me what we're doing there, you know. I mean, she's 5 years old. She's got it together. And And we get off the plane and I call a cab, and I do what any one of you guys would have done, you know. I called a cab. I said, take me to a hotel and stop at a liquor store because I got to figure out what's happened here, you know. And I came to, strapped down on this gurney in this gray room with bars on it, you know, completely restrained. And I didn't know where I was. I didn't know where my daughter was. I didn't know what had happened. I found out that I'd met this couple in this hotel we went to, and we started drinking, and I went absolutely nuts, beat up some guy there, and they just put me in a nut house. And thank God these people had grabbed my daughter and held on to her, you know. And I got out of there, and I said, Janet, we got to get out of Florida. This place is bad luck. And I'm going to tell you, for the next 2.5 years, that's the way it was. And I can sit up here and I can talk all night long about 1,000 stories in different places, and living in cars with that little girl on people's couches, and promising her over and over it's going to be different. And by the time my daughter was 9 years old, we were living in Oklahoma City. And we'd finally got this tiny little ramshackle little apartment. And I come walking in, and I had blood on my clothes, and I was drunk, and it wasn't mine. And she took one look at me, and she grabbed her pillow and her doll, and I changed clothes, and we headed out the back door. And I got on a bus, and I passed out. I come to in Gallup, New Mexico, and my little girl was sitting there, and she was rocking and crying. And I said, what's the matter, baby? And she says, Daddy, I am so hungry. You haven't fed me. And I said, as soon as we stop, I'll get you something to eat, honey. And I got off that bus in Gallup, New Mexico, and I went in this little liquor store, and I was so sick. And I went and got me a bottle of wine, and I got her a sandwich, and I got up to go pay for it, and I only had enough money for one or the other. And I had to put her sandwich back. I've done a lot of things in my life that I do not share from the podium. I'm very selective of who I share it with, but I've never done anything in my life that haunted me more than that moment. I got back to California. I went to go see my mom. My mom's tough. She opened the door, she looked at me, she looked at my daughter. Her hair was dirty, she was dirty, I was a mess. She grabbed my daughter, pulled her in the house, told me to hit it. I said, where are we going to go? She said, we ain't going nowhere. You are. Get the hell off my property. I'll call the police. And thank God for my mom, man. She's the best. She cuts you no slack. My next door neighbor gave her some trouble one time. She knocked him out with a shovel. I've been afraid of her ever since. Don't talk back to mom. Next 3 years, I was a whiner, you know. And what I'm going to tell you is I don't know. I don't know. I know people that saw me, and I know it's all hearsay. I lived in a place called State Beach in a bamboo patch right along the ocean. I called it my condo. And there was a 7-Eleven across the Coast Highway there, and I could go over there and I could panhandle for wine, and I could get enough wine, and I'd go down there and I'd drink until I passed out. And when I came to, I'd walk back up and I'd panhandle for wine until I passed out. And I would do that until you locked me up, or I got hurt, or I went nuts and you locked me up in a nut house or something, you know. And that's the way I lived for the next 3 years. I was standing out in front of that place one morning, and I was sicker than a dog. I think it was on a Sunday, because this car pulled up. And there's this guy in this square 3-piece suit. He pulls up in this square 4-door sedan. He's got this square little wife sitting there, these square little kids in the back. I'm looking at him wondering how in the hell can anyone live like that, you know? Good Lord. And he got out of that car and he come walking up to me and he looked at me and he said, hey, Kip, how are you? I looked him in the eye, and it was a guy that I'd known when I was a kid. He was one of those kind of guys I hated. Came from a real nice family, you know? He always had nice clothes, and everyone liked him. He played sports and never had no problems. His dad took him places, and I just hated people like that, you know. And he looked at me and he gave me $2. Now, I don't know if there's any winos here tonight, but I'm going to tell you. You go to these meetings and the topic of fear comes up. I'm going to tell you what fear means to me. Fear is standing in front of a 7-Eleven. You're physically addicted to alcohol. You've gone into grand mal seizures many times. You're standing there. They're not going to open up that cooler for 20 minutes. Your heart is starting to beat. You're sweating so bad. You're getting dizzy. You're starting to see the aura. Things are starting to happen. You got 65 cents, and a short dog cost 87 cents. That's fear. And this man gave me $2. That's enough for a quart of wine. That's going to keep me well till 3 o'clock, man. And I believed in Santa Claus, you know. And I shuffled in this store and I got my bottle of wine and I shuffled out. And as I walked by the window, I looked down and I saw these nice people looking in through the reflection of the window. And I knew they were judging me and I cursed them. And I went down to my little place and I said, La Porta, la doorway. And I started taking a sip, you know, and I had the damnedest thought I've ever had in my life. That maybe I ought to be going to A&A. I have no idea where that came from. But I'll tell you something about those square folks that were sitting in that car. They got to be real good friends of mine years later. And that morning, while I was thinking they were judging me, while I was opening up that jug, that whole family got out of the street right on that asphalt on their knees, and they prayed for that poor drunk for something to happen. About the time they were praying for me, the thought of going to Alcoholics Anonymous, which was the last thing I had ever thought about doing, you know. And I don't know how, but I ended up at a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous that night. And I walked in this room. You see, I've been to these H&I meetings and jails and institutions and all these places. I explained to them that I was not an alcoholic. I was a drug addict. I just couldn't afford any drugs right now. Hey, come on, you guys know that drug addicts have a lot more class than alcoholics. You know? And they had told me if I come into these meetings, they love newcomers. They'd welcome you with open arms, you know. So I come walking in this room and I sat down next to this pretty little gal. She moved all the way down. People started looking at me and kind of, well, let me explain. I've been living in the same clothes for 3 years. My hair was down to here, my beard was down to here. I weighed 135 pounds. I had sores all over my body, and a lot of things lived on me besides me. And I sat down, man, and all these people, they looked like you folks. And I knew I was in the wrong place, you know. You guys were talking about God. I saw you pass a basket. I knew you were going to start singing any minute. I'm getting ready to get out of here, man. I'm uncomfortable. I don't need this God stuff, you know, and I'm getting real uncomfortable. There's this old gal that's been staring at me since the minute I got there. Every time she'd catch my eye, she'd smile at me. I thought she was one of them wet-brained drunk women. I knew women couldn't hold their liquor. Something was wrong with her. Sick as I was, I knew I didn't have anything she wanted, you know, but I got ready to leave, and she jumped to her feet. And I've never met this woman again. And this is what she said. She stared right at me, and she said, I'm an alcoholic. And I walked into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous 27 years ago in Long Beach, California. She goes, I came in the back door and I looked at you people. And I saw you and I turned around to leave. Because I saw you ladies and you were ladies. And I saw you men and I knew all about men. She goes, I've been a prostitute since I was 14 years old, and I'd done everything a woman ever had to do on those streets to survive. And I knew when you saw who I was and what I was, you would judge me and ask me to leave like you always had. But someone grabbed me and got me a cup of coffee and brought me in the rooms and set me down and welcomed me to Alcoholics Anonymous. And they told me this. They said, stick around, we need you. I proceeded to talk about the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. She talked about her sponsors. She talked about her home group. She talked about her commitments. She talked about this wonderful life that Alcoholics Anonymous had given her. And she walked across that room in front of all those people and grabbed hold of me and kissed me right on the mouth. Bravest woman I've ever met in my life. Only a hardcore hooker from Long Beach could do that. And she held me real tight in her arms and she said, honey, she says, please, don't go nowhere. She goes, we need you desperately. I've never cried in my life. I didn't cry when I went to that prison in Mexico. I didn't cry when my son got... I didn't cry with my brother. I've never shed a tear in my life. I learned how to put on armor when I was 5 years old. And you don't show feelings. You don't show that to anybody. But something happened while that woman was holding me. She wouldn't let go. All of a sudden, this thing started happening right in the middle of my being, and it started rocking, and all of a sudden it came out, and it was this sob, and I started crying. And I wanted what you people had so bad. And so I started coming to this A&A, and you all lied to me right from the beginning, every one of you. You told me if I quit drinking alcohol, my life would get better. I have no idea what alcohol does for you, but I'm going to tell you this. Alcohol is not my problem. It wasn't my problem then, it's not my problem today, and it won't be ever. My problem, alcohol is my solution. It is not my problem. My problem is I have an acute allergic reaction to sobriety. You know? I get about 4 or 5 days with no liquor in my body, and all of a sudden I'm going, my God, why would anybody want to feel like this? You know? All that guilt comes, all those feelings, all that stuff, those pictures in my head that I can't get out. I can't go to sleep. I can't do anything. I can't even function. Now, you guys told me that I ought to get a sponsor. You told me about those steps. I looked at those steps. I've been on parole half my life. I'm not going to volunteer to one of you lops. I found out about this sponsor stuff, you know. And I looked at those steps, and I saw that, you know, and I went right straight to that fourth one. I said, what the hell is that? And he says, well, that's where you have to write down everything you've ever done, you know, and you got to admit it to another human being. I fell out of my chair laughing. I learned when I was a kid in Navajo, man, you don't cop to nothing, even if they got pictures, you know. Deny it, demand a jury trial, make them prove it, you know. You don't ever share a weakness with another human being. They'll use it against you. You tell people what they need to hear so you can get what they got, you know? You work them. You don't ever tell anybody what's really happening. You don't share fear. You don't share any of those feelings, any of that sissy stuff, you know? I go to these meetings, listen to you people talk, I'd just be so embarrassed for you. I'd just sit in the back, you know, and I went to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous on a regular basis for the next 6 years. And I could not stop drinking. I'd get about 10, 15, sometimes 30 days almost. And I would have to drink. I'd go absolutely stark raving sober. And I would have to drink. And I'd come back here and you people would welcome me back. And I come to on Christmas morning, 1983, in the rubber room, butt naked, handcuffed. My face is stuck to that rubber mat on the floor from the blood where the cops have beat me so bad that it broke my cheekbones, my nose. And I knew Santa Claus wasn't coming. I got out of that place, man, because it was Christmas. Those cops knew me so well. They said, Merry Christmas, Kip, we'll see you next week, you know. I shuffled off. And I made a decision that day. You know, I became absolutely convinced that I am that person in chapter 5. I'm not going to get sober. You know, there's something that separates from me from you people, man. I can't do it. Maybe you can. I can't. What I do is I drink. I ain't afraid of dying. But I sure am afraid to go without liquor. And I went, and you know, and I'd had about 30 days sobriety after that point, and I'd rat-holed a little bit of money, and I went down to this liquor store, and I got all the wine I could possibly carry, and I went up to this little shack I was living in, and I started drinking. And I drank, and I drank, and on January 6th of 1984, it was the absolute most tragic day of my life. Because at 4:30 in the afternoon, alcohol stopped working for me. And the whole world stopped. Alcohol no longer took away the pain. And I could not get drunk, and I could not get sober. And it didn't take away the guilt, and it didn't take away the visions anymore. And you see, I've been to Alcoholics Anonymous, and Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't work for me. And when alcohol stops working for someone like me, it talks about it in the vision for you. It says there'll come a time where you'll not be able to manage. You'll not be able to accept life with alcohol, and you will not be able to imagine it without it. You'll know loneliness such as few people can even imagine, and you'll come to the jumping off spot and you'll wish for the end. And at that moment, if loneliness would have been a tangible thing, it would have absolutely eaten me alive. I pulled out my gun with no hesitation, and I put it to my heart, and I pulled the trigger, and I blew my left lung and 2 ribs out and knocked me all the way across the room. And I'm sliding down that wall, and the only thing I can think of is, thank God this nightmare is over with. And then I come tumbling to this damn hospital. Y'all thought I died, didn't you? I come to in this room, and there's this old guy. He'd been sober in Alcoholics Anonymous so long, they only had one A in AA when he got here. I hated this old man because he came to me when all those years I was struggling in and out, and he got dead in my face. He got right down in my face. I had everyone else scared to death of me, but he got right in my face. He said, "You think you're pretty tough, don't you, kid?" Looked him right in the eye. I gave him my best jailhouse look. Said, "I'm tough enough, old man. Don't you ever doubt that." He looked at me and he got this big smile. He says, "You ain't tough." He says, "You're the scariest son of a bitch in this room." He said, "It might make you dangerous, but it sure don't make you tough." And he walked away laughing at me. Man, I hated that old man. When I opened my eyes in that room, I opened my eyes because, see, this guy named Charlie had a very distinct voice. Very deep, gravelly voice, and I hear this voice, and I've been in this coma for a few days, and I open my eye, and there's Charlie Tuck in the same suit I think he was born in. He had this blue suit. I never saw him. I think he was born with it. He always had the same suit on, and he had that big old ugly blue book, and he had these two dummy young newcomers with him, and their eyes were as big as saucers staring down at me, and he's looking at me, and I went, "Oh my God, I've died, gone to hell, and they got AA here." And Charlie's in charge of it, I'm laying there, I ain't gonna give it up, I ain't gonna cop to nothing, I keep my eyes shut, I think it's the guy's gonna start preaching this A&A stuff to me, man, won't even let me die in peace. And he doesn't say a word to me. What he says is he puts his arms around these two youngsters, and if there's any new people here, I want you to hear nothing else I say, I want you to listen to this closely. He said, "This is what happens to an alcoholic who doesn't take the steps. Come on, let's go." Obviously, he did not know how sensitive I was, I got out of that hospital after about 3 months, and they scotch taped me back together, and I got out of there and continued to drink, and May 12th, 1984 was like many, 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 many mornings. Alcohol had stopped working, but I had nothing else, and I kept trying. And every morning, the first thought I had, my prayer and meditation was, "My God, I'm still alive. I've got to do it again." But that morning, I come to, and I'm thinking about the ABCs that's read at the end of chapter 5. That's a weird thing to be thinking about, man, when you're sick and you need a drink first thing in the morning. But I've been to so many of these damn meetings, y'all have poisoned my mind. It says that I'm an alcoholic. I know I'm an alcoholic. I got paperwork from the state of California, I got no problem with denial about me being an alcoholic. But the 12 by 12 talks about something. It said, no matter what I admit to you, this step 1. It says, to my innermost self, in here where I live, that I have to totally understand exactly what that word means and what it applies. And all of a sudden I had that vision of that morning on that bus with my daughter. And then I knew. You see, this is what alcohol does to Kip Collins. When I put alcohol in my body from that second on, it doesn't matter about who I love or what I love. It doesn't matter about any of my plans, any of my dreams, or any of my morals or anything else. And it sure as hell don't matter about yours. I have to do what alcohol tells me to do from that point on. It tells me to get it some more. It tells me where I can live. It tells me who I can hang with. It tells me when I can go to bed. It tells me when I can get up. It tells me what I'm going to do all day long, and there ain't room for nothing else. Alcohol owns me. I got to that next part and it says there's no human power. I kept hoping one of you gals were going to fix me. And a few of you tried, and if you're here tonight, I'd like to make amends. And I got to that part that I wanted nothing to do with. You see, it was that God stuff. God had nothing coming from me, and I had nothing coming from God. I'd never asked him for nothing. And if there was a God, the world I come from, he certainly has a very perverse sense of humor. You know, God likes those people that live up in the suburbs. He don't like people like me. He never has. He's been pissed off at me from the gate, you know. And I've been doing fine without God for a long time. And I used to hate it anytime you people would talk about it. But I started thinking about it that morning. I started thinking about the people who had what I wanted, and it wasn't their money, it wasn't their women, it wasn't their stuff. It was a look in their eye and the way I watched them walk through life with a little bit of dignity. And all of them had the same thing in common. They talked about this power. They talked about this power that did for them what they couldn't do for themselves. And I got down on my knees that morning, and I said this little prayer, and I said, you know, I don't know who you are, and I don't know what you are, and I hope it don't make no difference. But from this day forward, I'll do anything that you put in front of me if I don't have to drink any alcohol. And if you're not there, I'm screwed. The longer I've been sober, this is the one thing I know, that I was given a state of grace that day. Because something happened to Kip right then and there. And I knew for the very first time, that if I could keep that concept, that I wouldn't have to drink that day. And I went over to that old man, Charlie Tuck, and I knocked on his door. And he opened, his wife, lovely Edie, one of the greatest members of Al-Anon I've ever known. She just opened the door and just said, oh, Kip, I'm so happy to see you. She said, let me get you some orange juice and some honey. Just sit right here. Charlie will be so excited. And Charlie comes walking out, and he got the blue suit on. And he looked at me and he just smiled. He says, what can I do for you? And I said, Charlie, I don't want to drink no more. He says, yeah? He says, what are you willing to do? I said, whatever you tell me. And this is what he told me. He says, Kip, he says, I've been watching you for a long time. People like you don't get sober. You don't even get sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. Something inside of you is broken. I don't know what it is. That's between you and your God. But I'm going to tell you this. I don't know why, but God has given you a window, and I suggest that you step through. And this is the way it's going to have to be for you, one day at a time for the rest of your life. And that is this, that absolutely nothing, no woman, no job, no child, no nothing in this world can ever be more important than you doing the things you have to do to maintain your sobriety. And the day that you think anything in this world is more important than you doing the things that you have to do to stay sober, that's the day you're going to take a drink, and you're never going to get sober again, and you're not going to die. You're just going to stay in that great twilight world. And he took me out in this park. It was on Mother's Day. And they were having all these families out there in Carlsbad in this big park. And he said, get down on your knees. And he got on his knees. And I looked around. I looked at these people. And I said, on my knees. He said, Kip, these people have been stepping over you for years. On your knees is progress. You're halfway up. And then he took me in and he introduced me to the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous vigorously. And I mean vigorously. I had to be involved in a step study, a book study. I had to be at a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous every single night. I had to be there early and stay late. I coming up on 90 days, he said, I almost got 90 days, Charlie. He says, so what? I said, well, 90 and 90, I said, yeah, but you remember me and you talked. You said, you're not like them people. You're right, you're not. You keep going to meetings till I tell you to stop. 3 years later, I had to carry 5 commitments a week, man. I mean, he had me here, he had me there. I'd come home, man. He'd say, go pick up this guy at Denny's. He's sicker than a dog. He's out there. Feed him, take him to a meeting, and sit with him till the liquor stores close. And this was in every single day, every day, day after day, day after day. And after a while, I met her at a meeting. There's a her or a him for all of us here. Some of us, several. But I met her, and she was just the most wonderful thing in the world, and a beautiful blonde lady, and she had gotten sober on the same day as I did, and we got married, and between us we had 6 children and a desire to stop drinking, and that's it. And I told her from the very beginning, as much as I loved her, how much do you know about love at 1 year sobriety? I don't know. But, she said, shouldn't we tell our sponsors? No, we'll talk to them later. My sponsor's real busy. I don't want to bother him with anything. And we got married. I told her, I said, nothing. You'll never be more important than me than AA. And she went, well, Neither will you from me. And I'll tell you this, for the next 10 years, we had one of the best marriages I've ever known anyone having. You know, and our meeting was based on the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the traditions, and we raised our kids, and you know, we got all the stuff. We both became very, very active in Alcoholics Anonymous. We were on every single committee. We've held every function there was to do in Alcoholics Anonymous in San Diego. You know, and my sponsor made me do really stupid things like get a job. You know, I informed him I needed to go to meetings and work on my recovery, you know, and he said, no, sober people work. You go to work every day and go to meetings every night and things will get different, you know, and I did this, you know, and I didn't know how to work, and through a strange circumstances I ended up a painter, and then pretty soon I was a painting contractor, and pretty soon I'm painting big giant $1 million jobs, and I got all the stuff, you know, and at 3 years sobriety, the state of California gave me my driver's license back, which I still haven't figured out why, but they gave it back to me. I got my contractor's license, and I got a phone call. And it was this little girl, and she says, "Is your name Kip Collins?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Do you know so-and-so?" And I said, "Boy, a long, long time ago." She goes, "That's my mother, and you're my father. And I've been looking for you, and I want to meet you, and I want you to meet your grandchildren." And she came into my life, this little girl that I'd looked for all those years, and I had a good life, and she brought me those grandbabies. And the funny thing about those grandbabies, you see, I've done a lot of time in institutions, and if there's any other convicts here, you know what I'm talking about, but when you go in there, man, there's a color line, and you don't step across it, you know, and I came in here with a lot of old ideas, and I might not have voiced them, but they were there. I ain't going to bother nobody, but man, there's a lot of separation and all that stuff for me. And I said, I'll never go there. Don't ever tell God you won't go there. You got to make God laugh, don't you? Just tell him your plans, you know. And she came over and she brought my grandchildren over, 3 of them, and all 3 of them are black. And I just went, okay. So much for that old idea. You know, and there was a great healing in that area of my life. You know, and at 10 years sober, I had everything. I mean, I was at it. My family's all Pentecostal evangelist, so I joined the Catholic Church. Powerless my ass. They still have prayer revivals in Oklahoma for me every single week, you know. But I was involved in my church. I was involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. I had a beautiful new home. I got the boat of my dreams. I got to do everything I dreamed about doing. I went to the Seattle convention and the international, and I came back, and from there I went to Australia for 2 months. And I just traveled Australia and went to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous for the next 2 months. I just met people and saw the country and had the greatest time in the world. And I came back to California, and I was just counting my blessings. Man, how do you get from that bamboo patch to where I am? How do you get there? And I opened up the newspaper, and I opened it up, and on the front cover there's this story of this man broke into this woman's house and raped her in front of her children and took a knife to her and cut her to pieces. And it was my daughter. And I'll tell you this, that I'm absolutely perfectly capable of first-degree murder if you touch anything I care about. See, I don't know about anger. I know about getting real quiet. I know about it getting real cold inside of me. And I know about making plans. I consider myself a professional. I expect to get away with it, you know, and that's what I'm doing. I'm making plans. This man's in jail, and he's in jail in a place where I've got a lot of brothers of mine. And all I got to do is write his name on a piece of paper and pass it on. And I'm nuts and I'm crazy and I can't talk about it, man. You don't talk about stuff like that, you know. And I can't sleep and I'm walking around absolutely nuts. And so my sponsor told me the answers were in the big book, so I start reading that big book. I'm looking for a loophole. There ain't one. What it says is this. It says that anger and resentments, if I'm an alcoholic, they're poison to me. They'll cut me off from the sunlight of the spirit and the insanity will return and I'll drink again. And there isn't any clause that says, unless someone rapes your daughter. It just says if you are an alcoholic, you cannot live this way because it will kill you. And I had to think of what my sponsor said, that nothing, no child, nothing could be more important than me doing the things I have to do. So I read farther in that book, and it says if I got a resentment I can't get away from, I got to pray for this person, have everything out of life that I want. The hardest thing I've ever done in my life was pray for that man. And I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to stand here and lie to you people and tell you I forgive him. It's an issue that I work on every day of my life, but the insanity went away. When I started talking to people about it, and I started talking to my sponsor about it, and I got through that side of it, and I didn't have to drink, and I didn't have to hurt nobody. And I got to go be with my daughter for the first time when she ever needed me the most in her life. I was there, I was sober, and I had the resources to help her and her children, and I was a father, and that's what she needed. She didn't need an executioner. And I was a grandfather to my children. And I got through that. The next thing I turned around, I'd had this thing going on in my lip here, and I went to the doctor, and he said, you've got cancer, and we're going to have to cut off your bottom lip. And I like my lip. I like it right where it's at, and he starts telling me what they're going to do, man, and I'm going to go see another doctor. And I went to 3 or 4 different doctors, and I finally found this one who said he could do this surgery, and they cut my lip from here to here down to here and put it back together. And I told him, I said, you can't put anything in my body that affects me from the neck up. He says, no way in the world you can't have pain medication. I said, you'd understand. You can't put anything in my body that affects me from the neck up. I'm in a lot of emotional pain. If you put anything in there to block that, I'm screwed. I would rather die of the cancer. And we did that surgery with Novocaine and aspirin, and I don't recommend that to anybody. I am not a tough guy, I'll tell you. I'm the scaredest son of a bitch in the room. And I got through that, and I didn't have to drink, and I came home, and something had been going on with my wife, and I adored this woman. I absolutely adored. I'd never loved a woman the way I loved her. And something had been going on. I didn't know what it was, and I came home, and she was crying, and I said, what's the matter, Connie? And she sat down, and she goes, we need to talk. And she looked at me, and she said, Kip, she goes, I love you. And I said, yeah, and I love you. And I said, what's wrong? She goes, I can't go on. I said, what are you talking about? She goes, I can't live this lie no more. I said, what are you talking about? She goes, Kip, I'm a lesbian, and I'm in love with Chrissy, and I have to leave. I didn't think she was going to say that. And I react the way I always react. I got pissed off, man, because this is about me, This is about me. How dare you treat me like this after everything I've done for you? Blah, 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 And I go talk to my friend Bill, Father Bill. He's a Catholic priest, been sober 28 years. And I start telling him, and he's a Catholic priest, he'll be on my side. And I tell him about this nonsense, and we sit there, and I'm running it all down to him, and he's going, shaking his head. He goes, my. And I said, so what do you think, Bill? He says, I think you owe her an amends. I said, what are you talking about? I told you what she did. He goes, that's none of your business. I go, what do you mean it's none of my business? He goes, you remind me of that guy on page 61 in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, what guy? Oh, that guy that thought he could wrest satisfaction out of life if he only managed well. Because sometimes he was kind, sometimes he was generous, whatever. But everything he did, there was a hook. And you keep going on and on saying everything you did for this woman, now she's treated you this way. Now, did you love her, or were you trying to manipulate her? Do you think marriage has something to do with ownership? I want you to go do an inventory on love and tell me everything you know about it. And all I know about love is what you people taught me. No one asked about my sexuality when I walked in here. No one asked about anything about me. He asked me if I had a desire to stop drinking, and you loved me. You loved me when I was an animal, when I stole your money in these meetings, when I threw up on your rug and passed out, and you told me to come back, and you loved me. And there was no conditions. So I wrote about that marriage, and I realized, that I didn't own this woman, and I truly loved her, and if this person could make her happier than I could, then that's where she should be. And we got a divorce, very amicable. She kept my last name. Today she's my sister. She's not my wife anymore, and we're very dear friends, and I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know. When a woman does you wrong, you kick him to the curb and go next, And we got to be good friends, you know. And right after that, you know, it was just me and my son, and I got attacked by this dog, and I almost lost my arm. I couldn't work no more. They repossessed my house. They took all the shit, everything, you know. And I finally got healed up a little bit, you know. And my son was he was deaf, and he was on a bowling league, and I took him bowling, and he got sick. And I had to take him to the hospital, and that was in May. And I sat in that hospital with him until November 4th. And on November 4th, he died in my arms. And the program of Alcoholics Anonymous works real good, because it was at that point right then and there. And I told them to take my son off the life support system, and I held his body through those last convulsions. And I hurt like you never ever dreamed that a human being could hurt. But it was at that time that I got to know, when the promises tell us it will know serenity. And I got to know what serenity means. See, serenity has nothing to do with me, with her, with a pocket full of money somewhere watching a beautiful sunset. Serenity to me was watching the thing I loved more than life itself die in my arms. And hurting like I didn't know it was humanly possible to hurt. And knowing in my heart of hearts that this was God's business. And this was okay. And God don't make mistakes. And I didn't have to drink, and I got down on my knees after I'd shaved my son and got him all cleaned out and ready for the coroner. And I thank God of my understanding for the program and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, who allowed me to be the kind of father that I dreamed about being the day he was born. Because see, we built that boat together, and we went on those fishing trips together. And when me and my son were together, man, we were my partner, and he looked at me with love and respect. And he was my dearest and best friend. And you people gave that to me. I threw it away, but you gave it back to me. And that little girl that I drug around the country, a man came in and asked me for that girl's hand in marriage. A real nice young man. And I was able to give them, I still had credit cards. I gave her exactly in Torrey Pines the kind of wedding I dreamed about giving her the day she was born. And I walked her down the aisle, and she looked at me exactly the way I dreamed the day she was born. And I gave her to this good man, and I pay $250 every single month, and I will the rest of my life, you know. And I never regret any payment I ever make, you know. But you gave that to me. I threw that away. You know, I didn't know what to do. I'd been, everything was gone. Everything, the money, everything was gone. The house, the family, the kids, everything. It was just me one more time, 10 years sober. I had been to the 7th grade, so I decided to go to school. And I went and checked some things out, some things I wanted to do, and I walked up and I said, how long will it take to do this? They said it would take 5 years. And I said, I'll give you 2. And I said, you can't do that. And I said, well, how many units would I have to take? And I ended up, my last year I did 24 units, a quarter with no breaks. And I got the piece of paper. I didn't get the best grades in the world, but I got that piece of paper, and I was almost ready to graduate, and the dean called me into the office and said, I need to talk to you. And I said, what was it? I said, well, obviously you think you're going to kick me out of here, or you want me for your personal assistant. And she goes, there's no gray areas in your life, is there, kid? You know? She goes, oh, I know, I need your high school diploma. I said, I haven't got one. I only went to the 7th grade. She goes, you can't do this. I said, I'm doing it. She goes, listen, you have to have a high school diploma by this week. Okay. And I go in this office down in this other place, and I go, GED. I said, listen, I got to get a diploma today. And they said, no, you can't do that. And I said, no, you don't understand. I can't. And I talked and begged this woman, and she let me take that whole test all at once. And I got a 95% on it. And I got a high school diploma. And I went to a pawn shop and I bought this ring right here. That's my high school class ring. Don't ever tell me I can't do something, you know. You know, and Of course, I wanted to jam a woman in my life immediately because I was lonely, And I told my sponsor I was lonely. He said, "You're horny." I said, "No, you don't understand. I need a relationship." He says, "You don't understand. An alcoholic cannot have a relationship as long as he needs one." He says, "You got to learn how to get comfortable with you. You got to live by yourself. You got to go to the movies by yourself. You got to start taking care of yourself. You stay away from those women. You can date them, but you don't get involved in any kind of relationship whatsoever." And so I did, and after a couple of years, man, I'm sitting home. I got a really nice house again. Me and my dog, everything's clean. Everything in my house is ironed and polished and clean. The yard's nice. I'm sitting there, I can watch anything I want on TV and stay up as late as I want. Eat cookies in bed, it's cool. And, I'm sitting here and I'm thanking God. I'm going, God, I know what he was talking about. Man, it is so comfortable inside here where I live. It's so nice, I like my company. But God, if it be your will, I would love to experience true love one more time. But everything's okay. 2 weeks later, I'm supposed to speak in San Diego that night, and I get a call in the morning, and this girl that I had dated for a while, and she started drinking, and she moved away, and her mother called me, and she says, I said, "Hey, how you doing?" She goes, "Oh, God, Carmen got in this car wreck. She was drunk with this other girl. She's got massive brain damage. She broke her legs all of like 18, 20 places." I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" She said, "Yeah, you can come and pick up your daughter." I said, "My daughter?" She goes, "You have a 3-month-old daughter. Didn't you know that?" And I went, "No." So I jumped in my car. I went to Los Angeles. I walked in. They gave me this baby in a little bassinet. I went out to my little sports car. I set it inside, and I looked at her. And I drove to San Diego, and I walked in this meeting, and I set her next to the podium. I have no idea what I said that night, And God gave me exactly what I asked for, because you know what? I fell absolutely head over heels in love. I mean, absolutely, totally in love with this little girl. And her name is Nanu Nanu, And for the next year, it was just me and her. Just me and her and the dog, and I bathed her, and a big healing came into my life, and I fell head over heels in love. I didn't need no woman, and me and her went to meetings together. We did all the stuff together, and I gave her a bath every night, and ironed her clothes and everything, man. And my house turned into a nursery. This bitchin' bachelor's pad I had. I got shit hanging off, little dolls and shit hanging off the ceilings and stuff, Absolutely ruined my image. But I was at a meeting. There's a gal that I'd known since I got sober. We would have many, many committees together. And one night she asked me if she could hold my daughter at this meeting. And I said, sure. So I gave her to her, and I looked at the way my daughter was looking at her. And I looked at the way she was looking at my daughter, and I went, wow. So I said, Sabrina, how you doing? She goes, fine. I said, so how's John? John was her husband. She said, oh, me and John have been divorced for 2 years. I said, oh, that's too bad. I'm so sorry to hear that. I said, what happened, if you don't mind? Well, I wanted to have children, and he didn't. I went, oh, you like children? And I started dating her. I mean, dating. You know what I mean? Just date, go out, not to a motel, just go out, and we got to know each other, and we started talking, and I fell deeply in love with this woman, and I asked her to marry me, and she said she would. It's the only thing I've ever been suspicious about, I mean, she's a real nice woman, and well, never mind. I couldn't find anything fault with her except that she was attracted to me, That's never been a good sign. And 22 months ago, she put a little boy in my arms.
All right.
Now, I'm 51 years old, and I have a 22-month-old son. His name is God's Will Casey. And I fell head over heels in love. Today, I have a job that if I got to describe what I would want more than anything in the world, I do it. I have that job. I have the most perfect life I ever dreamed about having. I didn't drink any alcohol today. I didn't hurt a human being on this whole planet today. I didn't hurt myself today. I worked all week long at a job I love. And every single morning when I left, my wife told me to hurry home. And every day when I came home, my children were waiting for me, and they were laughing and screaming when I walked in those doors. And I'm God's favorite kid. I wouldn't change anything in my life. The program of Alcoholics Anonymous is outlined in the first 164 pages. Will work for absolutely anybody, anywhere, under any circumstances. It don't matter what you've done or what you ain't done. I want to thank you for letting me be here tonight and share with you tonight and be a part of this conference. And I'm looking forward to my buddy Lamar. Man, you guys got a real treat Sunday morning, Mr. Spirituality. And that's all I got for you. Thanks.